The House chamber buzzed with subdued tension as Representative Jasmine Crockett walked steadily toward the podium. The morning's debate over education funding had already stretched for hours, marked by sharp exchanges and strict partisan divides. C-SPAN cameras panned slowly across the floor, capturing rows of lawmakers, some attentive, others scrolling through phones or whispering in hushed clusters. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her tone calm yet resolute, "I rise today to address the critical shortfalls facing public education in underserved communities across America." Her Texas drawl carried just enough edge to command attention. "In my district, classrooms are overcrowded, textbooks are outdated, and special education programs are woefully underfunded." She paused, eyes flicking briefly to her notes before continuing. "The bill before us proposes a 12% cut in federal education funding from last year, cuts that will hit the poorest communities hardest." Before she could proceed further, a voice interrupted. "Will the gentlewoman yield for a question?" It was Representative Matt Gaetz, rising from his seat with his trademark grin and a self-assured lean toward the microphone. Without waiting for permission, he continued, "I'm just wondering if the gentlewoman from Texas has actually read the bill she's criticizing, or if she's just reciting talking points her staff drafted this morning." Low murmur rippled through the chamber. The speaker pro tempore looked toward Crockett expectantly. "Does the gentlewoman yield?" Crockett lifted her gaze, assessing the room with a slow, steady calm. "I yield for a question," she said evenly. "Not a speech." Her composure stood in stark contrast to Gaetz's smirk. "My question is simple," he said, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. "Can the gentlewoman tell us exactly which page of this bill contains the so-called cuts she's describing? Or does she need to check her notes again?" The jab landed like a match strike in dry air. Conversation stopped. Even the usual murmurs faded. Personal digs were common in the House, but this one crossed an unspoken boundary. For a brief moment, Crockett stood motionless behind the podium, letting the silence settle. What she said next would not only dominate headlines for days, it would permanently shift the balance of her political reputation and Gaetz's own standing on Capitol Hill. "I thank the gentleman for his question," Crockett began, her voice measured, but cutting through the chamber like tempered steel. "To answer directly, yes, I've read the bill, all 341 pages of it." She flipped a page on the podium. "The cuts begin on page 73, section 1042, and continue through page 189. Specifically, a 22% reduction to Title I funding for low-income schools, elimination of the Striving Readers Literacy Program, and a 17% cut to special education grants." She lifted a stapled report from her desk. "And here," she said, "I have a district-by-district impact analysis. In the gentleman's own district, Escambia County schools would lose approximately $8.2 million in federal support, affecting over 15,000 students." A stunned quiet swept across the chamber. Gaetz shifted slightly, his grin beginning to falter. "But since the gentleman questioned whether I've read the bill," Crockett continued, "perhaps we should examine his own engagement with it." Her tone sharpened, like a cross-examining attorney. According to the Education and Workforce Committee records, Representative Gaetz missed 7 of the 9 meetings where this legislation was discussed. In fact, congressional attendance data shows he has missed 61% of Education Committee meetings since taking office, one of the highest absentee rates in this chamber. Murmurs began again, spreading like ripples. Gaetz's jaw tightened, but Crockett pressed on. "And while the gentleman may question my preparation, perhaps he should reflect on his own record. In 7 years, he has not authored a single education bill that received a committee vote. Not one." Gasps cut through the air. Gaetz opened his mouth to respond, but the speaker intervened. "The gentlewoman has the floor." Crockett nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker." Then, with deliberate calm, she continued, "It's worth noting that while this bill was being marked up in committee, the gentleman from Florida was attending a fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago. In fact, Federal Election Commission filings show 17 fundraising events during scheduled education meetings in the past 2 years. She let the statement linger before adding, "So when the gentleman asks if I've read the bill, yes, I have. The question, Mr. Speaker, is whether he's even shown up to do his job." The transformation in the chamber was palpable. Republican members who usually cheered Gaetz's provocations now avoided eye contact. Some discreetly flipped through the printed analysis Crockett had cited, realizing how damaging the cuts might be to their own districts. Gaetz finally tried to regain control. "Will the gentlewoman yield for a response?" he demanded. "I yield for a question," Crockett corrected smoothly, "as is proper under House rules." "My question," Gaetz began tightly, "is whether the gentlewoman acknowledges that this bill actually increases flexibility for local districts to allocate resources without federal interference." Crockett smiled faintly, the kind of smile lawyers give when they've been waiting for a line of questioning. "I appreciate that question," she replied, "because it allows me to clarify a common misconception. This bill doesn't grant flexibility, it shifts responsibility. It reduces total funding while forcing local districts to raise property taxes to make up the shortfall." She held up another sheet of paper. "In your own district, Escambia and Santa Rosa counties would need to increase local property taxes by roughly 17% to maintain current services. Is that the flexibility you're referring to? The flexibility to raise taxes or cut special education programs?" The blow landed clean. Gaetz remained silent. Crockett continued methodically, dissecting each major section of the bill, citing provisions, amendments, and data, until there was nothing left for rhetorical flourish to hide behind. The chamber was transfixed. Even lawmakers who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny the precision of her command. "Mr. Speaker," she concluded, gathering her notes, "I came to Congress to do the work the American people sent me here to do, not to perform for social media clips or fundraising reels. When members interrupt colleagues without reading legislation or attending committee meetings, they don't just disrespect Congress, they disrespect their voters." As she stepped away from the podium, the silence was profound. No shouting, no applause, just the uneasy stillness that follows when performance collides with substance. For Gaetz, the moment was devastating. His usual post-hearing media blitz never came. Reporters waited, but his office claimed he was unavailable for comment. The man who had built his brand on televised combat had been publicly cornered by facts. Crockett, on the other hand, was calm when approached outside the chamber. "I believe Congress should debate substance, not soundbites," she said simply. "The American people deserve representatives who actually do the work." By afternoon, the story was everywhere. Cable networks looping the exchange, analysts calling it a masterclass in preparation. But the true shock came later that day when a senior Republican on the Education Committee stood to address the Speaker. "In light of the data presented by the gentlewoman from Texas," he said, "I propose our committee reconvene to re-examine key provisions of H.R. 4762 before moving forward." The statement drew collective surprise, a rare admission of doubt from within the bill's own sponsors. One by one, other members echoed concern. "After reviewing the district-level analysis, I can't support the bill in its current form," said one Republican from a rural state. By the day's end, the once-assured bill was stalled, its passage uncertain. And across Capitol Hill, lawmakers, and viewers across the country were left with an unmistakable lesson. In an era of political performance, substance still has the power to silence the stage. The wave of Republican reconsiderations was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. A bill expected to pass neatly along party lines now found itself abruptly stalled. The sponsors, recognizing the votes had slipped away, agreed, grudgingly, to send the legislation back to committee for revisions. What had begun as a routine education debate had spiraled into a reckoning, and for Representative Matt Gaetz, the fallout reached far beyond one failed bill. Within hours, clips of Jasmine Crockett methodically dismantling his argument and his record spread like wildfire across social media and national news. Millions watched as she exposed his absenteeism and lack of legislative contribution in front of a stunned Congress. In his home district, the Pensacola News-Journal splashed a stark headline across its front page: Representation or Performance? Gaetz's record under scrutiny. The accompanying story compared his attendance and legislative record to other Florida representatives. The numbers weren't kind. The most damaging revelation, however, wasn't about speeches or ideology. It was about absence. Crockett's reference to Gaetz attending fundraisers during education committee meetings struck a chord with constituents who had long worried about local school funding. Within days, Gaetz's offices were swamped with angry calls, letters, and emails. "Why weren't you there?" one parent demanded in a viral voicemail. "Our schools are falling apart while you're posing for cameras." At first, Gaetz tried his usual playbook, branding the criticism as partisan theater. But this time, the facts were irrefutable, and even his media allies struggled to defend him. The numbers, attendance sheets, and FEC records left little room for spin. The breaking point came a week later, when the largest teachers' association in his district announced plans to meet with potential primary challengers. It was an unprecedented move in a safely Republican district, and a signal that his political foundation was cracking. Alarmed, Gaetz scheduled an emergency town hall. The event was supposed to be damage control, but what unfolded was something else entirely. Gone was the swaggering firebrand who relished confrontation. Instead, voters saw a subdued, almost chastened congressman. He arrived with policy papers in hand, took notes as teachers spoke, and offered detailed responses rather than applause lines. "It was like he suddenly realized he actually had to do the job," remarked one local civics teacher. But the consequences of that House floor exchange rippled far beyond Florida. Across Congress, other representatives who had built careers on media theatrics took notice. Committee chairs reported higher attendance at hearings, particularly among those previously known for skipping them. Theatrics gave way, at least partially, to preparation. Members who once interrupted colleagues for viral moments began showing up with policy documents instead of slogans. When the Education and Workforce Committee reconvened to revise H.R. 4762, they incorporated key amendments preserving the very programs Crockett had defended: Title I funding for low-income schools and grants for special education. By the time the bill finally passed, it looked markedly different from the original. Crockett's meticulous advocacy had rewritten its substance, and perhaps reshaped congressional expectations in the process. For Representative Crockett, the aftermath was transformative. Colleagues, Democrat and Republican alike, sought her expertise. She was invited to strategy sessions, policy briefings, and drafting meetings. "She treats legislation like case law," one member said admiringly. Line by line, fact by fact. Her evidence-based approach became the gold standard for new lawmakers trying to establish credibility in a polarized chamber. 6 months later, the consequences for Gaetz became official. When committee assignments for the next congressional session were announced, his name was conspicuously absent from the Education and Workforce roster. The slot once occupied by a self-proclaimed fighter went to a freshman Republican with a background as a school administrator, someone who had campaigned explicitly on focusing on results, not performance. The message from party leadership was unmistakable. Substance mattered again. 18 months later, the ripple effects still echoed. Crockett's confrontation had become a staple in political science classes and media literacy programs nationwide, a rare instance of preparation triumphing over performance in real time. For Gaetz, however, the damage was irreversible. Investigative journalists, tracing the breadcrumbs from Crockett's floor rebuttal, uncovered a deeper pattern: years of missed committee sessions, abandoned legislative projects, and a disproportionate focus on media appearances. Then came the unthinkable: a serious primary challenge in one of the safest Republican seats in the country. His opponent, a retired Navy officer and former school board member, ran on a simple slogan: representation, not performance. In his campaign launch, he declared, "Committee meetings aren't optional. Reading bills isn't optional. Serving your district isn't optional." Local coverage, once deferential to Gaetz's television fame, began contrasting his media time with his congressional work. The Pensacola News-Journal even launched a weekly accountability tracker, measuring attendance, votes, and bill sponsorships for every Florida representative. When the primary votes were counted, the results stunned political observers nationwide. Gaetz, who had once coasted to victory by 30 points, lost by just over 3. A political earthquake. In his concession speech, visibly shaken, Gaetz admitted what few expected to hear. "I came to Washington to disrupt the system," he said. "But along the way, I confused disruption with distraction. My constituents have reminded me what representation really means." For Crockett, the story was the opposite of hubris. Instead of chasing the viral fame her speech had brought, she buried herself deeper into legislative work. Her office became known for producing the most thorough policy memos on the Hill. Representatives from both parties quietly requested her analyses before key votes. "She changed the culture," a congressional scholar noted. Not through outrage, but through rigor. Political scientists began referring to it as the Crockett effect. Measurable shifts followed. Committee attendance rates rose. Average floor speeches became shorter but denser with policy detail. Members started citing bill sections and statistical data in debates. "We're seeing a reversion to substance," said a longtime House parliamentarian. In the age of fact-checking and viral accountability, performance without preparation has become a liability. Outside Washington, the confrontation sparked a broader civic awakening. Civics teachers began showing the C-SPAN footage in classrooms to illustrate the difference between rhetoric and responsibility. "Students need to see this," one government teacher explained. "This is what accountability looks like in action, facts winning over theatrics." Scholars and commentators drew key lessons from the episode. First, Crockett proved that mastery of facts still trumps performance, even in an era ruled by viral clips. Second, it revealed how digital transparency has reshaped accountability. Attendance records, FEC filings, and bill histories are now public knowledge, accessible to every voter with a smartphone. Third, it showed that beneath partisan polarization, voters still share common expectations. They want representatives who show up and do the work. Gaetz's downfall in a district that should have been safe demonstrated something profound. When performance politics is exposed to factual sunlight, substance still wins. 2 years later, as Congress once again debated education funding, a freshman representative cited line numbers and impact data while challenging a senior member's amendment. Asked afterward where she learned to prepare that way, she smiled and said, "I watched the Crockett-Gaetz exchange during my campaign. I decided then I'd rather be a Crockett than a Gaetz." For students of democracy, the moment had become more than viral history. It was a case study in institutional self-correction. It proved that even in the age of spectacle, accountability can still thrive when citizens and leaders alike insist on evidence over performance. As one high school civics teacher put it, while showing his class the now iconic clip, "This is what democracy looks like when it works." Disagreement is healthy, but only if it's built on facts, not theater. When politicians trade substance for spectacle, they don't just fail their voters, they fail democracy itself. If this breakdown of political accountability inspired you, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories revealing how real governance, not performance, shapes our democracy.